Human found the alien girl chained to a frozen obelisk and her master demanded his silence. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Commander Jacob Matthews trudged through the blinding snow, his breath visible in the freezing air, the bitter wind biting at his face like thousands of tiny needles. The sky above was an endless expanse of gray, and the world around him seemed frozen in time, devoid of life, except for the faint creaking of ice as it shifted beneath the immense weight of the frozen landscape. His mission had been simple: navigate the icy plains of the unknown planet and scout for any potential hazards that could threaten the nearby human outpost. But nothing had prepared him for what he was about to discover. As Jacob moved deeper into the frozen wilderness, his boots crunched through the snow, the sharp sound echoing in the vast silence. The cold seeped through his thick coat, making his body shiver despite the layers of protection. His sensors were picking up nothing unusual. Just as he thought the trek might be a waste of time, a flicker on his display caught his attention. It wasn't much, just a small reading, but it was enough to pique his curiosity. Following the signal, he pushed forward, scanning the area carefully. The wind howled in his ears as he reached a vast open area, and in the middle of the ice field, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. There, in the center of a massive frozen obelisk, was a figure. At first, he thought it might be an illusion, the way the ice had distorted the view, but as he drew closer, his heart pounded in disbelief. A woman, no, a girl, was chained to the obelisk. Her skin shimmered with a faint greenish hue, a stark contrast to the surrounding snow and ice. Her body was frozen in place, her expression one of despair and exhaustion. She wore nothing but tattered remnants of clothing that barely clung to her body, the cold having long since stolen the warmth from her fragile form. Jacob approached cautiously, his instincts telling him to be wary, yet his heart refused to turn away from the helpless creature. As he reached out to touch her chains, a voice echoed from behind him. "Step away, human." Jacob spun around, instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. A figure stood there, tall and imposing, her presence radiating a dangerous aura. The being before him was unmistakably alien, with skin the color of molten amber and eyes that glowed with an intense, almost hypnotic light. She was clearly not someone to be trifled with. "You don't understand," the alien continued, her voice cold and commanding. "If you free her, you will seal your fate." Jacob held his ground, his mind racing as he weighed the risks. "Who is she?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the air. The alien's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "She is mine," she said simply, her words dripping with possessiveness. "And you, human, are nothing but a fleeting curiosity to me." Jacob's mind whirred as he processed the situation. He could feel the weight of the decision on his shoulders. The girl chained to the obelisk was in desperate need of help, but the alien before him was clearly not someone who would let him interfere without consequences. "What do you want with her?" Jacob asked, his voice firm despite the unease creeping up his spine. The alien took a slow, deliberate step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "I need her silence," she said, her voice laced with venom. "And I will do whatever it takes to ensure she remains that way." Jacob's heart clenched as he stared at the girl, her eyes filled with terror and pain. It was clear she had endured far more than any being should have to. And yet, she was still alive, still hanging on, even in the face of such cruelty. The decision was clear. Jacob stepped forward, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't let this alien intimidate him. He couldn't. Not when a life was at stake. He reached out and touched the chains, trying to find a way to break them free, knowing that every second he spent hesitating could mean the difference between life and death for the girl before him. Jacob's fingers brushed against the cold chains, and the girl's faint breathing sent a wave of urgency through his body. Her eyes flickered toward him, a silent plea for help. He glanced up at the alien standing imposingly before him, her eyes glowing with a dangerous, unyielding light. You have no idea what you're dealing with, she said, her tone carrying the weight of finality. If you set her free, you will regret it. Jacob stood still, his breath heavy in the freezing air. He couldn't let fear dictate his actions, not when there was someone in need. The girl's shackles were nothing more than a physical barrier, but her eyes told a different story, one of mental and emotional imprisonment, of a life lived in servitude and torment. As he examined the chains, Jacob's mind raced. He had to break them. He had to help her. His eyes darted to the glowing red eyes of the alien, whose stance was firm and unyielding. He could feel the tension building, but he wasn't going to back down. I'm not afraid of you, Jacob muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the alien. He turned back to the girl and slowly, carefully, examined her restraints. The chains were thick, but with the right force, he might be able to break them. Who are you? Jacob asked, keeping his voice calm. The alien woman took a step closer, her piercing gaze unwavering. I am her master, she said with a cruel smile, her voice dripping with authority. She is my property, and I've kept her here for a reason. She was born to serve, and you're not fit to interfere with that. Jacob's jaw tightened. He didn't care what this alien's rules were. This girl Zira was no one's property. She deserved a life of freedom, of choice. His gaze softened as he met Zira's eyes again, her fear still evident, but there was something else, a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she believed in the possibility of escape. Jacob's hand hovered over the chains, his fingers testing the strength of each link. With every moment that passed, the alien's presence grew more suffocating. You can't help her, the alien warned again, her voice like ice. I'm giving you one chance to walk away. Let her be. If you interfere, I'll make sure you never speak of this to anyone. Jacob felt the weight of her words, but it only solidified his resolve. He couldn't turn away from someone in need, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, he grabbed hold of the chains and pulled, his muscles straining against the frozen steel. The chains didn't budge. The cold was biting through his gloves, but he didn't stop. You're wrong, Jacob said quietly, looking back at Zira. You're more than just a prisoner. You're a person. And I'm not leaving you here. His hands tightened around the chains again. With a sharp pull, the ice around the shackles cracked, a loud snapping sound echoing in the cold air. Zira's eyes widened in disbelief as the chains finally gave way, falling to the ground with a heavy clatter. She stumbled forward, her body weak from being chained for so long. Jacob caught her before she could fall, supporting her fragile form in his arms. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and gratitude. For the first time, she seemed free, truly free. The alien's face twisted with fury. You've made a grave mistake, she hissed, her voice shaking with anger. She's not meant to be free. You'll pay for this. But Jacob didn't care. He looked down at Zira, his heart pounding in his chest. You're safe now, he whispered, his voice soft but filled with conviction. The alien moved toward them, but Jacob stood his ground, his body between her and Zira. Stay away, he warned, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline rushing through his veins. The alien sneered, but she didn't make another move. For a moment, the world felt still, as if time itself had frozen in that moment of defiance. Jacob knew the danger wasn't over. They still had a long way to go before they were truly free from the alien's grasp, but for now, he had one simple truth to hold on to: Zira was no longer chained. And that was a victory, no matter what came next. Jacob held Zira in his arms, feeling her shiver against him, her body trembling not just from the cold but from the shock of her newfound freedom. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, filled with gratitude and confusion. The chains that had bound her for so long now lay at their feet, a symbol of her suffering that had finally been broken. Jacob steadied her. As she struggled to find her footing, her legs weak from the prolonged immobility. You're safe now, Jacob whispered again, his voice low but reassuring. Zira's gaze flickered to the ground, where the chains now lay in a crumpled heap of metal and ice. I never thought I would see this day, she murmured, her voice shaky. Her words hung in the cold air, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Jacob knew they couldn't stay here, not with the alien still watching them. He glanced up at the looming figure of the alien, whose fury was palpable. The alien's eyes burned with an intensity that could melt stone, and Jacob could feel the weight of her gaze, heavy with menace. "You don't understand what you've done," the alien said, her voice a harsh whisper, like the wind howling through a canyon. "She was meant to stay chained. She was meant to serve. And now you've doomed us both." Jacob took a deep breath, shifting to block Zira from the alien's sight. "We're not your property," Jacob said firmly, his voice steady. "She's not your slave, and I won't let you treat her that way." Zira's eyes softened as she looked at him, and for the first time since Jacob had found her, a spark of hope flickered in her expression. The alien stepped closer, her presence imposing and filled with undeniable power. "You're foolish, human," she spat. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." But Jacob didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his mind racing as he thought of a plan. They couldn't stay here much longer. The storm was growing stronger, and the alien would stop at nothing to get Zira back. "You think you can stop me?" Jacob said, his voice low, the challenge in his words clear. The alien's lips curled into a sneer, her eyes narrowing. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I will hunt you down, and I will make you pay for this mistake." But Jacob only nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'll protect her," he said simply, his voice filled with determination. "I'll take whatever comes for her." Zira clung to him, her hands gripping his jacket as if she were afraid he might disappear. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob looked around, scanning the bleak horizon. The storm was intensifying, and the visibility was dropping. They needed shelter, and fast. "We need to move," he said, his tone firm. "There's a cave up ahead. We'll be safe there for now." Zira nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude, though the fear still lingered in her expression. As Jacob helped her to her feet, he could feel the weight of the situation. They were far from safe. They had no idea how far the alien's reach extended or what kind of forces she could bring against them. But for now, he had Zira, and that was all that mattered. With the storm howling around them, they set off toward the cave, Jacob's hand firmly gripping Zira's, guiding her through the snow and ice. Each step was a small victory, each moment a reminder that they were alive, and that they had a chance to escape. The alien would come for them, that much was certain. But Jacob was ready to face whatever came, for Zira and for the chance to give her the freedom she so desperately deserved. The wind howled as Jacob and Zira made their way through the dense snow, their progress slow but steady. The storm was relentless, pushing against them with every step, but Jacob's determination was stronger than the cold. Zira clung to him, her feet unsteady on the icy terrain. She had never known anything like this freedom, warmth, and now, the feeling of someone standing beside her who wasn't trying to control her. She had spent so many years in chains, both literal and metaphorical, that the simple act of walking alongside someone without fear felt strange, yet comforting. They reached the entrance of the cave just as the storm picked up, the biting cold beginning to gnaw at their exposed skin. Jacob ushered Zira inside, his eyes scanning the dark space for any signs of danger. The cave was small but provided shelter from the brutal weather. Inside, the air was warmer, the stone walls offering some respite from the freezing temperatures outside. Jacob took a deep breath, letting the warmth soak into his body as he knelt beside Zira, who was struggling to keep her balance. Her legs were still weak from the long period of being chained, and her body was trembling from exhaustion. "You okay?" Jacob asked softly, his voice low. Zira nodded, but her face was pale, and her hands shook as she tried to steady herself. Jacob moved to her side, his concern deepening. "You've been through so much," he said, gently helping her to sit down. "You're safe now, but you need to rest." Zira glanced up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, yet tinged with sorrow. "I've never been safe before," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to feel, how to live without fear." Jacob sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture of comfort. "You don't have to know everything right now. You've survived more than most ever could. You're stronger than you think." Zira let out a soft breath, leaning against the cave wall as her eyes closed for a moment. I don't know what's going to happen next, she said, her voice shaky. But I feel different. Free, maybe. Jacob smiled slightly, though there was a sadness in his eyes. I'll make sure you stay free, he said firmly. I don't care what it takes. No one will control you again. For a moment, the only sound in the cave was the wind howling outside, a reminder of the storm that raged beyond their small refuge. Jacob watched Zira carefully, noticing the way her body seemed to relax slightly as she sat there, her guard down for the first time in what seemed like forever. She had been through so much, and the scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. But Jacob wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cave, there was a sense of peace that neither of them had known for a long time. They had made it this far, and Jacob was determined to ensure they would survive whatever came next. The alien who had once held Zira captive was still out there, and Jacob knew the threat was far from over. But he had made a promise to her, and he would keep it, no matter what. As the hours passed and the storm continued to batter the cave's entrance, Jacob found himself thinking about the long road ahead. He didn't know where they would go or what would happen once they left this place. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, he was fighting for Zira's future. The future she deserved. And with that thought, he allowed himself a moment of rest, knowing that whatever happened, they would face it together. The storm outside had begun to lose some of its intensity by the time Jacob woke, but the temperature inside the cave was still bitterly cold. He shifted slightly, the rough stone beneath him uncomfortable, but his thoughts were not on his own discomfort. He glanced over at Zira, still asleep, her chest rising and falling steadily in the dim light of the cave. Her long hair, still matted and tangled from her time in captivity, shimmered faintly with an otherworldly glow, but there was a peacefulness to her now, a calm that had been absent the day before. Jacob couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. He had promised to protect her, and he intended to keep that promise. His thoughts turned to the alien who had once held Zira captive. He knew that Zira's escape was not going unnoticed. Her former captor would be looking for her. Jacob's grip tightened on the rock beside him as he stood, stretching his stiff muscles. He needed to keep moving. The cave had been a safe haven, but only for a moment. The threat was still out there, and Zira's former master would stop at nothing to get her back. He turned to Zira, who was still asleep. Her breathing had deepened, and she looked peaceful for the first time in what seemed like forever. He hated to wake her, but they couldn't afford to stay here for long. Zira, Jacob said gently, kneeling beside her. It's time to go. Zira's eyes fluttered open, and she blinked a few times, disoriented. Her gaze met his, and for a moment, he could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the fear that still lingered beneath her newfound freedom. Where are we going? She asked, her voice soft but filled with uncertainty. Jacob gave her a reassuring smile. We're going to keep moving. We'll find somewhere safe. I promise. Zira nodded slowly, pushing herself up with Jacob's help. She seemed stronger, though still weak from her time in captivity. As she stood, she swayed a bit but regained her balance quickly. The moment was brief, but it was a step forward, a small victory in the battle for her freedom. Together, they left the cave, stepping back into the cold, but this time, Jacob felt a little more certain of their path. The wind still howled, but it didn't seem as threatening now. As they walked, Jacob kept a close eye on their surroundings. The terrain was harsh and unforgiving, the snow deep in places, and the mountains in the distance seemed to stretch on forever. They would need supplies, and he had no idea where they might find shelter in this vast, frozen wasteland. How long do you think we can keep moving? Zira asked after a while, her voice hesitant but tinged with curiosity. Jacob glanced at her, his eyes narrowing as he considered their options. We'll move until we find a safer place. There's a settlement not too far from here. We can get supplies there. Just keep going. Zira nodded, but there was something in her eyes that told Jacob she wasn't convinced. The fear hadn't completely left her, but he could see that she was trying to trust him. He knew that for both of them, trust would be a long road. They walked in silence for a while, the crunch of their boots the only sound as they made their way through the snow. Jacob could feel the weight of the journey ahead, but he also felt a sense of purpose, something he hadn't felt in a long time. As they moved forward, Jacob found himself thinking about Zira's future. It wasn't just about escaping her captor anymore. It was about giving her the chance to choose her own path. To live a life where she wasn't shackled by the past. He had promised to protect her, but he also wanted to give her the freedom to become whatever she dreamed. The thought of Zira's future, free from the chains of her past, was enough to keep him moving. The storm outside might have passed, but the real challenge had only just begun. The snow beneath their feet grew deeper as they continued their trek through the frozen landscape. Jacob kept his pace steady, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The wind had died down slightly, but the air was still frigid, and the mountains ahead loomed like a never-ending barrier. Zira walked beside him, her steps slow but determined. It was clear she was struggling, the weight of her past still clinging to her like a shadow. But Jacob could see a change in her. A flicker of something new, something that hadn't been there before. She was trying to find her footing in a world that had once kept her captive, and though the road ahead was uncertain, Jacob knew she was beginning to trust him. As they approached a ridge, the sight of a small settlement appeared in the distance, barely visible against the white expanse of snow. Jacob's heart lifted slightly. They had made it farther than he had expected. "We're close," he said, glancing over at Zira. "We'll get some supplies there, rest, and then figure out our next move." Zira looked up at the settlement, her expression unreadable. There was something in her eyes, a mix of relief and doubt. "Do you think they'll help us?" she asked quietly. Jacob hesitated for a moment. The settlement was small, and he knew there was no guarantee of safety. But they had no other choice. "We'll find out soon enough," he said, giving her a reassuring nod. "Just keep your head down, and we'll make it through this." They continued their journey, the cold biting at their faces as they drew closer to the settlement. The buildings were simple, mostly made of wood and metal, and there was a sense of life here, despite the harsh environment. As they reached the edge of the settlement, Jacob noticed a group of people standing by a small market. They looked up as he and Zira approached, their faces a mix of curiosity and wariness. Jacob held his breath, but the people didn't seem hostile. "We need supplies," Jacob said, his voice steady. "And shelter for the night, if you can help." A tall man with a thick beard stepped forward, his eyes flicking to Zira before returning to Jacob. "You're not from around here," he said cautiously. "What's your business?" Jacob didn't hesitate. "We've traveled far," he said, his voice firm. "We're just looking for a place to rest and some provisions." "No trouble." The man studied him for a moment, then glanced at Zira again. "All right," he said, his voice softening. "We've got a place for travelers. You can stay the night, but there's no room for anything more than that. Got it?" Jacob nodded, relieved. "Got it. Thank you." The man motioned for them to follow him, and they made their way to a small building at the edge of the settlement. Inside, the warmth was a welcome relief, and Zira let out a soft sigh as the heat hit her. Jacob watched her closely, noticing how she seemed to relax for the first time in days. As they settled into a corner of the room, Jacob couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. They had made it this far, and for now, they were safe. But he knew that the journey was far from over. The alien who had controlled Zira was still out there, and the danger was far from gone. Jacob's thoughts were interrupted as the tall man returned with a bundle of supplies, blankets, food, and some fresh water. "This is all we can spare for now," the man said. "But it should be enough to get you through the night." Jacob nodded gratefully, taking the supplies. "Thank you. We won't forget this." The man gave him a curt nod before turning to leave, but not before his eyes lingered on Zira. Jacob saw the look of concern in the man's eyes but didn't say anything. As the door closed behind him, Jacob turned to Zira, who was already starting to eat. She looked up at him, her eyes bright despite the exhaustion. "We're really safe here," she said softly, almost to herself. Jacob smiled faintly, though he knew it was only temporary. "For now," he said, settling down beside her. "But we'll make sure it lasts." They ate in silence, the warmth of the room slowly chasing away the cold from their bones. Jacob's mind kept racing, thinking about the road ahead, about the promise he had made to Zira. He would keep her safe, no matter what. And together, they would face whatever came next. The warmth from the fire was a welcome relief, but Jacob could feel the weight of their situation pressing on him as he sat across from Zira. She had settled into the corner of the small room, her body wrapped in a thick blanket, her eyes flickering between exhaustion and something else, uncertainty. It had been a long few days, and though they were safe for the moment, the reality of their situation was never far from his mind. The alien that had once held Zira captive was still out there, and the threat was very real. Jacob glanced over at the supplies the tall man had left for them. It was a small comfort, but he knew it wouldn't last long. They would need more, and soon. But for now, they had a roof over their heads and warmth in their bones. "We'll figure it out," Jacob muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Zira looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "What happens next?" she asked softly. The question had lingered between them since they had arrived. Jacob let out a deep sigh, his mind racing through their options. There was no clear answer, no easy path forward. But they had to keep moving, keep fighting. "We keep moving," he said, his voice firm. "We'll get as far from here as we can, find a place where they can't find us." Zira nodded, though there was a flicker of doubt in her expression. "Do you really think we can outrun them?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. Jacob met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we don't have a choice. We have to try." There was a long silence between them, the sound of the fire crackling softly in the background. Zira shifted uncomfortably, then spoke again. "Do you ever wonder if we'll ever be free?" Jacob's heart tightened at the question, but he didn't let it show. He knew the road ahead would be long and hard, but he also knew they had to keep their hope alive, no matter how slim the chance. "I don't know what the future holds," he said honestly. "But I do know one thing, we're free now. And that's a start." Zira looked at him, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob smiled faintly. "No need to thank me," he said. "We're in this together." Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling through the settlement, but inside, the warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship they shared felt like a small victory. They had survived another night, and for now, that was enough. Jacob leaned back against the wall, his eyes drifting to the small window, where the snow continued to fall in thick, relentless sheets. The world outside was cold, unforgiving, but in here, they were safe at least for the moment. Zira had fallen into a light sleep, her body still tense but relaxed for the first time in days. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the horizon, something they couldn't see yet, but that was inevitable. The alien would come for them. That much was certain. But Jacob had made a promise. He would protect Zira, no matter what. His mind drifted back to their earlier conversation, and he found himself wondering what true freedom would feel like for her. She had been bound by chains for so long, not just physically but mentally, emotionally. What would it take for her to truly feel free? Jacob didn't have the answers, but he knew that the road ahead would not just be about survival. It would be about rebuilding, about giving Zira a chance to live a life she had never known. The thought filled him with a quiet resolve. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to let anything take that away from her. He glanced over at her one more time, making sure she was still asleep. Her breathing was steady, and for now, that was enough. Jacob closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the storm outside lull him into a light sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but they would face them together. And for now, that was all that mattered. The morning light filtered weakly through the small window of the room, casting faint shadows on the walls. Jacob stretched, feeling the stiffness in his muscles from the long journey and the restless sleep on the hard floor. The fire had died down to embers, but the chill of the morning still lingered in the air. He glanced over at Zira, who was still asleep, her body wrapped tightly in the blanket. The exhaustion of the past few days had clearly taken its toll on her. Jacob stood quietly, not wanting to disturb her. He moved to the window, scanning the horizon. The settlement was still as quiet as it had been the night before, the thick snow covering everything in a blanket of white. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't yet see. The alien who had once held Zira captive would surely be on their trail by now. Jacob's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of movement behind him. He turned to find Zira stirring, her eyes slowly opening as she woke from her sleep. She blinked a few times, disoriented, before her gaze met his. "Morning," she said. Quietly, her voice still thick with sleep. Jacob smiled gently. "Morning. How are you feeling?" Zira sat up slowly, stretching her arms and wincing slightly as she moved. "Better, I think," she replied, her voice a little stronger than the day before. "I didn't realize how tired I was." Jacob nodded. "It's been a long few days. But we're safe for now." Zira looked around the small room, her expression thoughtful. "For now," she echoed softly. Jacob's smile faded slightly at her words. He could tell there was still a part of her that wasn't fully trusting of the safety they had found here. He couldn't blame her, after all, she had been living in fear for so long. The weight of her past was heavy on her shoulders, and Jacob knew it would take time for her to truly feel free. He moved toward the supplies the tall man had left for them the night before, pulling out some food and water. "We should eat and get ready to move," he said, his voice steady. "We can't stay here for too long. The alien who captured you, she'll come looking for us." Zira's eyes hardened slightly at the mention of her former captor. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm not sure what we're running from, but I know I can't go back to that life." Jacob handed her a ration of food, watching as she took it gratefully. "You won't have to," he said firmly. "We'll keep moving, and we'll find a place where you can finally be free." Zira nodded, though her expression was still clouded with doubt. She took a deep breath, as if trying to steady herself. "Where will we go?" she asked. Jacob thought for a moment before replying. "There's a larger city a few days' journey from here. It's not perfect, but it's a good place to start over. We'll blend in, get supplies, and keep moving from there." Zira glanced at him, a flicker of hope passing through her eyes. "And you think we can make it there without being caught?" Jacob met her gaze, his eyes filled with determination. "I don't think we have a choice. But I'm not going to let them take you. Not again." The weight of his words hung in the air for a moment, but Zira seemed to draw some comfort from them. She finished her meal in silence. Then stood up and stretched. "Okay," she said, a sense of resolve settling over her. "Let's go." Jacob grabbed his pack and checked the equipment, making sure they were ready for the journey ahead. The road would be long and dangerous, but with each step, they were moving farther away from the past and closer to the future they both hoped for. As they stepped out of the small building and into the cold, Jacob felt the weight of their situation pressing on him. The alien could be anywhere, and time was running out. But for the first time in days, he allowed himself a brief moment of hope. They had made it this far. And together, they would keep moving forward. The cold air cut through them as Jacob and Zira moved further away from the small settlement. The morning sun had risen, but it did little to ease the harshness of the landscape. Snow stretched out endlessly in every direction, the barren wilderness surrounding them like a silent, watchful sentinel. Jacob adjusted the straps of his pack, feeling the weight of their journey ahead. His mind kept returning to the same thought: they were not out of danger yet. Not by a long shot. Zira walked beside him, her footsteps slower than his, but she didn't seem to mind the cold as much as before. Perhaps it was the sense of purpose now driving her, but something in her seemed stronger. The past few days had been a test of endurance for both of them, but this new path they were walking felt different. They were no longer running from their pasts, they were walking toward something, even if they didn't know what that something was yet. Zira glanced at him as they walked, her expression still guarded but softer than when they first met. "Do you think they're still following us?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Jacob looked ahead, keeping his eyes on the horizon. "I'm sure they are," he said, his voice steady. "But they won't find us if we keep moving. We just have to stay ahead of them." Zira nodded, her eyes distant as if she was processing the weight of their situation. And what if they do find us? Her voice was quieter now, almost like a whisper. Jacob slowed his pace slightly, glancing over at her. He knew the fear in her voice wasn't just about being caught, it was the fear of losing everything again. We'll deal with it, he said firmly. We've come this far. We'll keep going. Zira met his gaze for a brief moment, and in that brief exchange, Jacob saw something shift in her. It was subtle, but it was there, hope, or maybe just the willingness to trust again. They continued walking in silence, the wind growing stronger as they moved farther into the wild terrain. The mountains loomed ahead, their snow-capped peaks a reminder of the vastness of the world they were navigating. Jacob's mind wandered to the settlement they had left behind. The people there had been kind enough to give them supplies, but he knew they couldn't stay. He had no intention of bringing trouble to their doorstep. Zira's safety was his priority, and that meant moving on. They had to keep moving. As the day wore on, the snow began to fall heavier, the ground beneath their feet becoming more treacherous with each step. Jacob kept his eyes focused on the path ahead, but he could feel Zira lagging behind, her steps growing slower and more labored. He stopped for a moment, turning to look at her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his concern growing. Zira nodded, but there was a weariness in her eyes that wasn't there before. "I'm fine," she replied, but Jacob could see the exhaustion in her face. "We should rest for a bit," he suggested. "We've got a long way to go, but I don't want you pushing yourself too hard." Zira didn't argue. She simply nodded, and they found a small patch of ground by the edge of a rocky outcrop to sit down. Jacob dug into his pack and pulled out the remaining rations, offering some to Zira. They ate in silence, the snow continuing to fall around them. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. As they finished their brief meal, Jacob packed up the supplies and stood, offering his hand to Zira. She took it, allowing him to help her up. "We can't afford to stay here long," Jacob said, glancing at the snow-covered horizon. "But we'll rest when we need to." Zira didn't respond right away, but Jacob saw the gratitude in her eyes. There was no longer any hesitation in her movements. The woman he had met days ago, broken and afraid, was starting to emerge from the shadows of her past. And Jacob, though still uncertain of what lay ahead, knew one thing for sure: he wasn't leaving her behind. They continued their journey, step by step, with the harsh winds of the wilderness blowing against them, but together, they were facing the unknown with nothing but the promise to survive and move forward.